It's a pleasure to welcome Wayne Kalayjian to our beautiful and historic Church of the Advent. We love God in this historic and beautiful place, and Wayne loves God and historic and beautiful places, so we fit together really well. We're fortunate Wayne has taken time out of his tour of speaking engagements in the area and has included us. Wayne is a local boy from Needham, Massachusetts. He and I are both related to Betsy. He by blood, me by marriage. He is her cousin, I'm only her husband. In the course of his career as a structural engineer and architect, he's been a principal project manager on Boston's famous Big Dig, and the main architectural engineer when that famous lighthouse in Truro on the Cape needed to be moved away from the edge of disaster as the dune on which it stood eroded. That was Wayne that saved that building. Wayne likes saving buildings, and he's written the story of how a forward-thinking Pope Benedict XIV and 3 mathematicians saved Michelangelo's dome atop St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. He's here to tell us about the book, take a few questions, and then we're going to have some light refreshments and light conversation with Wayne. Welcome.
Thank you, Jay. Thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. This is a wonderful church, of course, architecturally. And I know from Betsy and Jay that it's such a spiritual haven for so many. And it's a pleasure for me to be here, so thank you. We're going to talk about a wonderful story that I learned about 40 years ago and stuck with me. It was in a history of civil engineering. It's a classic book, actually. And in the very middle of the book, there were 4 pages. And the author very casually mentioned, there was these cracks in the dome of St. Peter's, which 3 mathematicians did something. They did something really unique, different, and important. And it was designed by Michelangelo. And at the time, I was 20 years old, studying art history as well as civil engineering. I said, how come this isn't a bigger story than, I've never heard of it before. Someone, I'm sure, has written lots and lots about this topic. How could they not? The most famous church in the world, by the most famous artist who ever lived, in the most famous city on the planet, right? I'm 20 years old. I'm sure there's plenty of books written on the topic. So over the years, I've studied a lot of art history, and guess what? Not anyone has ever written on this topic. Yet, I didn't really have a burning desire to do anything about it until about, 4 years ago. I decided to say, I don't think I've ever heard anyone written a book about this topic. And why don't I give it a shot? That's really what happened. And I had a literary agent from a book about 12 years ago that failed. By the way, writing a book, you have to be accustomed to 2 things. Very thick skin and a lot of failure, because it is not easy. The odds are against you, and there's plenty of competition. So it's not an easy thing to write a book for publishers or agents, for that matter, to even take note of what you have to say. That's why I knew that when I had this topic in my gut, I knew this was a winning story. I knew it. For all the reasons I just described. But the trick was to convince others that there was something important worth writing about. When I mentioned the topic to my agent Laurie, you'll hear her name probably throughout tonight. Her reaction was just, she didn't say it, but I could tell she was thinking it. Wayne, you're talking about the most famous church on the planet by the most famous artist who ever lived and the most famous city on the planet. And you're telling me, thousands of books have been written on those three topics. And you're telling me that you have come across something new. When you put it that way, suddenly your confidence kind of erodes a little bit. But I do believe that it was new. And I knew it was important. And I knew that I hadn't come across it. And I've done a lot of reading in the art history and in the history of engineering. So I said, no, Laurie, I don't think that anyone's ever done it before. So she said, okay, I'll do some research myself. And she came back about a week later and said, yeah, I can't find one either. Now, there's plenty of histories about St. Peter's Basilica, and they casually mention this episode, but they don't really know what they're talking about, because to be able to talk about this subject, you have to be an engineer. Right? You have to be an engineer, structural engineer, because the concepts are pretty complicated. And on top of that, you have to be able to communicate and write pretty well. Engineers are really good at a lot of things, but writing is not one of them. I've been fortunate because I've done a lot of writing. And so I knew that if I could write this story well, I think people would like it. And plus, I knew that if I could get Michelangelo's name in the title, right, that would grab people's attention. Let's face it, when people who are interested in nonfiction history, they love World War II and they love the Italian Renaissance, right? I mean, those are two winners almost every time. So I think I had the psychology of how to sell the book. And again, as a first-time author, the publishers are interested in one thing, two things. They're interested in, can I trust this author to deliver? And number two, will this book sell? Because that's all this is about, right? They want a book to sell. If it's not going to sell, okay, it might be a literary gem, and maybe they'll get some kudos for that, but at the end of the day, they're in business to make money. I knew that I had a good story from the start. I had all the elements that I think would get people's attention. You had the drama of a major structure on the teetering on collapse that no one ever really knew that it was on the teetering on the edge of collapse. You had Michelangelo, you had Rome, you had St. Peter's Basilica. And if I could tell this story with the drama that it deserved, I think it would succeed. Fine. What I didn't expect, so I did expect it was going to be about the dome, and that it was going to be about the mechanics, the engineering, the concepts. I knew that was going to happen. But what came next was probably the biggest and best surprise, because this story, if you read the book, is really not about the dome. It's about the people who populated the story and the people who saved the dome. And there are 8 of them. And I go into the story about each of them. Very few of these people have ever sort of come to life. This book is the first time that 2 of the 3 mathematicians actually get a biography, because there's no biography of them. Zabalia, we'll talk about in a minute, he too has never had a biography. And Poleni has never had a biography. So of the 8 characters, this is the first time half of those people actually get some credit. And people who read the book actually say, oh, he was born here, he's how he was raised, sort of the life story. And I think that each of these characters kind of deserved it. And I wanted the book, my kind of, the models authors that I was going after, if you've ever read people like Eric Larson or David McCullough or Ross King or Ken Follett, they write not only about the story and episode, but they write about the people, the culture, the politics, the society, the religion, right? Because it's all one, right? It's not just one slice. They're all part of the story. So I wanted to capture that because I think that those authors write such compelling stories. So that was my mission. Once Laurie said, okay, I think it's a good idea. Here's what you have to do now, Wayne. You have to write a proposal. And this is common. When you think contemplating a book, you have to write a proposal, because that proposal is what the agent will submit to the publishers. And it consists of two components. First, you have to write all of chapter 1, and then you have to write what we call chapter summaries for everything that comes next, page and a half, which means you have to have an outline, or table of contents, which means you have to know the story. Now, it doesn't mean the table of contents can't change, but you have to kind of know what you want to tell, how you want to tell it. Right, and by the way, as your research evolves, by the way, you're going to know a lot more at the end than at the beginning, so everyone understands that whatever you're writing is going to change. But you still have to write it in a way that has some kind of command, right? You know what the story is, you know how to tell it. Okay, now I know nothing about 18th century Italy, nothing. All right, I know nothing about the popes or Vatican history, other than I know Julius II, Paul III, Sisters. These are great popes who had influence on our history. And because I studied art history, you come across these popes. But you don't know who they are, you don't know when they were pope, you don't really know much about them, you just know their names. So I had to go up this learning curve real quick, right, on, okay, what's the story going to be? How am I going to tell it? And what's chapter 1 going to look like? Because I have to write about 15 pages worth. And by the way, when you write a book, you don't write it in pages. You don't say, I'm going to write a 300-page book. You write it in words. So this is 80,000 words. Okay? I actually wrote 120,000 words, but it got edited down naturally, because in the process of editing, you just distill it, and you throw stuff out, and maybe you save a passage or a page for a later book, right? So this is 80,000 words. And if you ever say, hey, I'm going to write a book for 300 pages, they know you're a rookie, okay? They know that you don't know the business, because everything's in word count. And anything less than 60, 70,000 words is probably not publishable, because you have to make it just the right thickness to sell it at a certain price point. And if you make it too thick, then you make it more expensive than probably the audience or the readership is probably willing to pay. This is like the sweet spot, okay? When you go to a bookshop next time, look at how many books are like this thick, right? Now, the thicker books might be the noted authors. People are willing to spend $40, $45 for a thick book, very dense, right? But most authors are like this. And that's 80,000 words. So the first chapter, each chapter is about 6,000 words, plus 5 to 6,000 words. So that's roughly 15, 17 pages. So you got to figure out what you want to say in that 17 pages. Well, I don't know 18th century Italian yet. I know the story, though. So I thought to myself, well, this would be a good time to just introduce the Pope. That's pretty safe. Right, it's a short biography. And by the way, how did he get to be the Pope? And what's the problem? That's kind of like a safe way to start it, right? You don't need to know the story yet. You can try to set it up. So that's what I did. And you start to research this guy, Pope Benedict XIV. His name is Prospero Lorenzo Lambertini. He's from Bologna. And he is an amazing guy. And he grows up in Bologna, he goes to Rome, becomes a lawyer, is out on his own, decides to become a priest, which, by the way, is a very prestigious position at the time. And not that it's not now, but it was a very high calling, and prestigious, tremendously prestigious. He becomes a member of the Vatican shortly thereafter. He's immediately become like a leading lawyer at the Rota. The Rota is the administrative law court at the Vatican. So all the issues of, sort of like the Supreme Court of the Vatican. And he's like the lead judicial adjudicator in the Rota for many years. He becomes what's called the devil's advocate. So he's always seeing issues from multiple perspectives and helping the Pope adjudicate as wisely as possible. So he's in this position for many years, and in this role, he becomes invaluable to many popes. And one in particular, his name is Benedict XIII, who is always asking for at this point, Cardinal Lambertini's guidance and advice. When Benedict XIII dies, there's a papal conclave. Now, Benedict he's Lambertini, he's Cardinal Lambertini. He attends his first conclave, and Clement XII becomes the Pope. Notice how suddenly I become familiar with these popes, right? They start to become very familiar to you and human. Clement is old and feeble, but actually very energetic for about 8 years, but he dies. So they go into the next papal conclave, and these conclaves are held. Does anyone know where the conclaves are held? Sistine Chapel. You go into Sistine Chapel, you are locked inside the Sistine Chapel. Okay? And that means your food is provided to you through a turntable. You see no one except these cardinals see no one but the cardinals, and they each have a valet. All right? And the Sistine Chapel turns into a hotel for the next several days, weeks, months. It turns out to be 6 months. It's the longest papal conclave in history. After 254 ballots, and they're going through the winter, the spring, the summer, and the Sistine Chapel now is climate controlled. There was no climate control in those days. And you go through the Roman damp, dank winter and the spring, and then the hot, humid summer, the fleas and the lice, and it's not very pleasant. And they're not young men, right? They're all in their probably 50s and 60s, so they're not in the prime of their life, right? And this is not a pleasant experience. So they're in the morning, in one of the biographies describe it, in the early morning, Prospero, I call him Prospero, Lambertini is having tea with his friend, Cardinal Acquaviva, in one of these small areas where they're just congregating. And Cardinal Acquaviva asks Lambertini, well, what do you think? Would you like to be Pope? And Lambertini apparently didn't want the job and actually said, well, I guess, something like, I guess if I'm elected, I guess I'll serve, but I'm not like something I terribly am after. Well, within a few hours, suddenly there's like this clamor for Lambertini to be Pope. And within 12 hours, there's the next vote, the 255th vote. And he is elected almost unanimously as the next Pope. So you kind of ask yourself, okay, this guy never apparently wanted to be the Pope, and he certainly never campaigned to be the Pope. And he becomes the Pope. Interesting. And he assumes within 5 days he assumes the crown and all the regalia of becoming the Pope, and he assumes the name Benedict in honor of his benefactor Benedict XIII. So he becomes Benedict XIV. That's how he becomes Benedict XIV. He is a very interesting guy. He's well learned. He loves science. That's a major, we're in the middle of what's called the scientific revolution. Isaac Newton, among many, Galileo, even Leonardo da Vinci. These are all part of the legacy of what we call the scientific revolution. And he loves this stuff. He's also very literary, and he attends one of the most prestigious literary clubs in Italy. And he has all kinds of friends from all sorts of backgrounds. He's a very, we call him a Renaissance guy, today, but he was just interested in so many things, and people loved being around him. He was very gregarious. He had a tremendous wit. He was one of those guys that everyone sort of respected, and as someone who they could trust and could get along with, and he was very well learned, and he was just very well rounded. He was very progressive too. He believed in that boys and girls should be educated. Now, we think, okay, well, how that progressive? In those days, that was not the case. He also believed that women of academic achievement should be promoted, and he actually sponsored 4 of them to be professors at the University of Bologna. Unheard of. Bologna and Padua were the leading centers of scientific knowledge in all of Europe. The University of Padua, well, we might get to, hopefully we will, was actually the MIT of its day. Right? The Italians were the center of scientific achievement outside of Cambridge, where Isaac Newton was, but that had waned since he had died. So that's Benedict XIV. And I knew after I read about his biography, this guy is going to carry the day. This is going to be the centerpiece of the book. And that is what happened. But then, on top of that, there were other characters who started to emerge. And to understand the dome and the failures of the cracks at the dome, you had to understand how the dome got there, which means you have to go back to Vatican Hill, Imperial Rome, and give the reader a sense of this building didn't just emerge. It really took a lot of hard work to get there. And so the book is really 5 chapters of context. And you really don't start to get into the cracks per se and what happened to fix the cracks, spoiler alert, until chapter 6. And 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 wrote themselves. Chapter 6 was the hardest. Chapter 6 actually didn't write itself. Chapter 6 was definitely the hardest chapter. But 7, 8, 9, and 10 wrote themselves. And by that point, I had come to know the story. I came to know the characters. And it was almost as if the characters were telling me what to write. And by that, now, you may say, oh, that's pretty cool. But I can assure you, it took me months to get to this point. Why? Because, again, you had to go back 1,700 years, and there's a lot of events, a lot of issues, a lot of people. And you're coming across dozens and dozens and dozens of names. And they're all Italian names, so they all kind of have a similarity to them. Vanvitelli, Poleni, Lambertini, right, et cetera, right? And they all sound like that. Half of them, facetiously, are named Giovanni, so that adds. On top of that, the same person has it's not unusual for the same person to have a slightly different spelling. Over the years, different people have somehow changed their name when they write about it, or maybe it's an error, maybe it's intentional. So you have to ask yourself, okay, is that the same person, even though their name is different, or is that a different person? Right? And then you have the confusion of what actually happened, because it was not well written. I mean, the only one who writes about it really is Poleni, and we'll talk about him. And he does his best to write it. Without him, we wouldn't even know much about it. But even he writes about it in a kind of a non-sequential way. It's kind of jumbled. So when you read the book, I kind of tried to take this bowl of spaghetti and pull out the strands and lay them out. In fact, it was a bowl of spaghetti. Everything is happening at once. but I'm trying to, the reader cannot understand the story if I tell it that way. So it might read like I'm telling it in sequence, when in fact a lot of these events were concurrent. So you got to give the Pope credit, because in the swirl of all this controversy that's happening, he is able to discern, okay, I think this idea is the right way, but I need some validation from other sources, and he's very wise in how he's proceeding. So going back to the proposal, that's the first half of the proposal. The second half of the proposal is when you're going to have to sell this, right? You are a debut author. No one is going to give you any credibility from a publishing standpoint. You've written some articles, okay, you've written some papers for journals. That's not writing a book. It proves that you know how to write, but it doesn't prove that you know how to write a book. So these publishers, you don't get a deal very often, right? You get about a 3 to 5% chance of getting an agent, and about a 1 to 2% of getting a book deal. Okay, so the odds are like 1 in 8,000, 1 in 10,000 of getting a book deal. It's pretty slim, right? There's a lot of people out there on the street who want to write a book, right? So the publishers and the agents hear it every day. They get dozens of emails. I have a great idea, right? Okay. So I knew that I was fortunate to have an agent who believed in me. And she did believe in me, and she's really good. But this marketing piece is, who do you know? How are you going to promote it? How are you going to sell this thing, right? Because the publisher is going to want to know that you're going to, after you write it, what are you going to do? How are you going to sell this thing? So that's the marketing piece. So that took 11 months. The proposal takes 11 months. So finally we get it done. She ships it around. She shops it around now. She's having, now remember, the proposal is a reflection on her as much as it is on me, right? So the reason why an agent is important is because they know everyone. And she certainly does. She's probably sent it out to 40 publishers, and 2 expressed interest. Others, some either didn't respond, others said, yeah, it looks interesting, but it's probably a little dry. And they were going to be in for a surprise, because they probably just looked at the cover and assumed wrongly that it wouldn't be interesting. And then I got an interview. We went through the interview, went fine, I thought. Then I later learned, oh, this guy doesn't have the platform. Okay, so it was all about the marketing. Forget the story. The guy doesn't have the platform. Okay, and then Pegasus says, Wayne, we would love to publish your book. It would fit so lovely in our European history collection. I said, okay, cool, right? And so Pegasus was actually trying to sell me, thinking that I had other offers, right? Unbeknownst to them, they were the only one. But all you need is one. And by the way, Pegasus is pretty good. They're a very good label. And as soon as we got the deal from Pegasus, Laurie said, Wayne, Pegasus is known for its covers. And they certainly are. I mean, this is phenomenal. And they were wonderful to work with, and they are wonderful to work with. But authors and agents and publishers do not do a thing to help you research, write, promote. Nothing, right? Well, I shouldn't say nothing. They're there, but they don't do very much. It's all on the author. So you have to be prepared to work really hard. And I did. And so once we got the deal, it was within a month I got the deal, which is actually pretty good. And then, up to then, it's sort of like you could tell people, oh, I'm writing a book. Yeah, and you're writing the proposal. Oh, I'm writing a book. I'm writing a book. And then you get the book deal. And you have 2 choices, 12 months or 18 months for the manuscript. And suddenly it becomes very real, right? It's no longer like, oh, I'm writing a book. It's like, oh, I'm writing a book, right? And I chose 18 months, and when they say 18 months, it means manuscript delivered the insert delivered, and this is a task in itself. So when you read the book or any nonfiction history and they happen to have photographs or pictures, plates, right? These individual items are called images. You don't call them photos, you call them images. And the entire collection of them is called the insert, all right? So, and typically it comes in multiples of 4, so I could have done up to 32. I think there's 29 of them. And just getting the insert in marketable or ready form was 4 months in itself. It's just a massive effort because you have to deal with two things: copyright and ownership. And in my case, luckily, all the images were beyond 100 years, so you didn't have the copyright issue, but you did have ownership issues to deal with. So each of these images are owned by someone or something, and you need permission, and then some kind of payment. It's not unusual. In many cases, in my book, so long as I gave credit to the institution, they didn't require a payment. So anything from Getty Research Institute, anything from the Princeton Marquand Library of Art and Archaeology didn't require a payment, so long as I gave them their due. Everything else, though, you have to pay. And guess who has to pay for it? The author, right? But on the flip side, I did get an advance. Now, an advance is nothing more than we'll front you some money and we're going to get it back. We hope we get it back. If we don't, that's the loss on the publisher. But if your book does well, we're going to get paid back whatever we advance you, and then you'll get your percentages that are in the contract. That's why they don't give debut authors much advance, because how many books do you think an average author who debuts a book actually sells? How many think it's 50,000 or 5,000? 5,000, 5,000, yeah. Actually, it's closer to, like, if you're lucky, you'll get 2,500. Most books don't, you think, oh, how many libraries are there in the country? Half of them will buy the book. That's 50,000, right? Doesn't work that way. So for the publishers to make their money back, they have to sell, probably the sweet spot's like $4,000. 4,000 books, and most books don't sell that, so that's why they don't give much of an advance, because they're reticent to front that money. But they did give me, they gave me $8,000, which is not bad, because I think they saw that it had a good potential. When I got the advance, though, I don't like to get advances. I said, you know what, I don't want an advance. I want the book to do well, and then you can just pay me. And Laurie said, don't you ever do that. Getting an advance is very prestigious. It means that the publisher believes in you, so you take it, right? And if it means you get deferred on your payment, doesn't matter. Now I can go in front of an audience at the Church of Advent and say, I got an advance, right? So, and it's true, right? It's sort of it's a recognition that the publisher believes in you, right? And plus, it helps pay some of your expenses, right? If you have to travel, like to Rome or to Italy, and it was helpful. So then you get your advance, and then the work really starts, and I put a schedule together. Okay, I have 12 chapters, and it's going to be 4 to 6 weeks. If I do 4 to 6 weeks on each chapter, that'll put me here. That'll still give me time to do the inserts. Then you have to do the bibliography. Then you have to do the endnotes. Then you have to do the index. You have multiple rounds of editing. So I still do. I was working full time, so my days were pretty full. I would work about 3 hours in the morning before work, 2 hours after work, every day, Monday through Friday. And then on Saturdays, I'd probably put in about 8 hours. And then on Sundays, I'd probably put in 6 or 7 hours. Right? So it was a lot of work. But at the same time, you almost had to do it, Because if you don't do it, you lose momentum. And momentum's really important. Some days the words flow easier than others. And on those days where it's kind of tough, you do research, right? And at least you try to write a few sentences, try to write a paragraph or so, at least try to get the next thought moving. Then there are other days where you write 4 pages at a time, right? The thoughts just flow and it works. But these thoughts that you're putting down in your manuscript will be edited and edited and edited yourself and by other editors hundreds of times during the course of your writing. And of course, as you move forward in the research, you learn more, right? You know more at the end than you do at the beginning, right? So when you're doing your first research, okay, you learn stuff, and then you come across other sources a month from now, 2 months from now, 3 months from now, that say, oh, I got to write that. I didn't know that. That's going to go back into chapter 1. I've got to include that in chapter 1. And now you have a deeper appreciation of the whole period, right? And so now you're just gaining more knowledge, right? But you have to keep moving. So you write chapter 1, you do it. Then you go to chapter 2. These are all independent chapters, thoughts, right? You're not remembering the many times you use the word prior, P-R-I-O-R, in chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3. I say this because when you put all 12 chapters together, you print them out for the first time, a year and a half later, you print out all 12 chapters. Now you have to read it not as 12 independent units, but as one cohesive manuscript. And then you realize, I've used that word prior like 150 times. The reader is going to go insane, right? In fact, Laurie told me an anecdote about another author who she said had this tendency to use the words in fact. Okay, now I never use that because I know that that's not a good, or the word frankly, because frankly, if you have to say the word frankly, it means you're not serious about everything else, because now you're being frank, right? So I try to avoid that too. And so Laurie was saying, well, that author, after halfway through, she had to throw the book across the room because she was so frustrated by the words in fact. So you have to be very mindful that you as an author have a tendency to express yourself a certain way. And you will continue to express yourself that way for the entire manuscript. But it will be very annoying. Your tendencies could be very annoying to a reader. So you have to go back through once you put all 12 chapters together, you have to read it from the point of view who's someone who has not read it before. And then you start catching your idiosyncrasies, your favorite words, your go-to phrases. In the meanwhile, so now I've been told, Wayne, you use the word in the meanwhile. I think what you mean is meanwhile. And I say, no, I use the word in the meanwhile because that's me, right? And by the way, these editors, once you put your manuscript in, they're really good. They're very professional. They know enough to say, okay, you know what? In the meanwhile may not be the way it's traditionally used, but this is the way this author speaks. And we want to keep the voice of the author. A good editor does not change the text. A good editor is cognizant of the author's stylistic tendencies and is looking out for the author to make sure that whatever is written is obviously grammatically correct, but still maintains the spirit of what the author is trying to say, the author's voice. So those editors who go in and start ripping apart a manuscript, they're not really editors, they're just rewriting, right? A good editor is very aware that they're there as a support, not as the main event, right? It's not about them, it's about the author. And I had some wonderful editors. What's really interesting is that these editors all have their own stylistic tendencies, and they would get into arguments, because I would see it on the email trails. They would get into arguments about proper footnote methodology. Right? And to me, it's like, okay, well, I mean, they're both pretty good, right? They both say the same thing. But they, as editors, have very particular ways, in their view, of how footnotes should be structured. And they would get into, I would see the battles. Like, you do this, that, and the other thing. And I frankly didn't care. So long as the footnotes are consistent, I don't care about that. So we get into the book itself. And one thing that struck me in particular is that this Pope, Benedict XIV, more than anyone else, he viewed science not as something to be feared, which was something that much of the church was about. They viewed God and the divine word as or science as a threat to God and the divine word. Benedict XIV actually has a much more modern point of view, which is science, mathematics, they're extensions of God. They're examples of God's magnificence, right? So it wasn't something to be fearful of. And so that was a key component, because what happens in the story is that Luigi Vanvitelli, who's the architect of the Vatican in 1740, once the Pope is coronated, 2 years later, Vanvitelli does a survey of the dome, and the dome is literally cracking apart. Now, the book goes into, how could this be? How could these cracks, which have been in, the dome's now been has been built for 150 years. How could these domes only recently have developed these kind of cracks? There's been no earthquakes, nothing, not that we know, or nothing that's severe that would cause this kind of crack. And my theory is that people just didn't know what to do, so they kind of ignored it, right? So these cracks became so large and so big, so dramatic, that something had to be said. So Luigi Vanvitelli tells the Pope, we have a problem. That's chapter 1, the Pope's problem. We have to deal with these cracks. Unfortunately, no one knows what to do. And up to that point in time, the way you solve things in the world of construction was, what did we do the last time? I think that wall's thick enough. Oh, how thick did we use it at the last basilica? Let's ask the master mason down at that construction site. Let's just get collective guidance. What does my intuition tell me? There was nothing scientific about it. It was all intuition. So, to this Pope's credit, within a couple days of him learning about the severity of the issues, he knows he has plenty of architects, plenty of contractors he could turn to, but he has this inspiration. He has these friends that he knows through the literary societies that he attends, the scientific community meetings that he also is aware of and he has attended, to reach out to these three, they call themselves mathematicians. They were actually physicists. And they were half his age. They were young men. They were in their 30s. He's in his 60s. And within a few days, they come to the Vatican, and he just said, hey, look, I have this problem. What do you think? So they come up, they look at the dome, they look at the cracks. They go to the dome 2 or 3 times, they visit it. They're guided by these architects, and you can imagine these architects who've been around the construction world saying, I don't know why these mathematicians are here. Right? They don't have any construction background. They've never designed a thing. They're academics. They're mathematicians. What are they doing here, right? So these mathematicians go away, they come and go, and for the next 3 months, they come up with these ideas. What they were doing was, hey, look, they were actually the leading experts in what we call Newtonian physics, which had been invented by Isaac Newton about 50 years earlier. And it was all the rage in Europe, and it still is an incredible feat of discovery that Newton came across. But these three in particular knew the Principia, which is the foundation for Newtonian physics, better than almost anyone else in Europe. And their idea was, and Newtonian physics is basically gravity, how does the Earth and the stars move across the galaxy? How do we predict behavior? If I drop this book, how quickly will it fall? How do I predict what we call velocity or speed? He came up with these amazing ways of predicting behavior that we see in the real world. So these mathematicians said, how do we take what we know as scientific and mathematical truth? Can we actually apply that to this problem? What? Right? I mean, that's amazing. Why would you do that? Up until now, science and math is over here, the real world is over here. Why would you bring the two together? But they had this idea that, look, if we can calculate the amount of force that's coming down and observe why the dome is out of sorts, and then figure out what is supporting the dome, what's the strength of the dome, and then compare the two and see what the difference is numerically, and then see what we have to do to close that gap numerically so that the dome is stable. Now, this is what we do today. Okay, this is exactly how we approach problems today. This is structural engineering. It had never been done before. Never been done before. This was a complete paradigm shift. And no one had ever thought of thinking a problem this way in the everyday world. So they write a paper, and they deliver it 3 months later to the Pope, January 1743. It's called the Parare. It's a long title. These papers in Italian, by the way, these books in Italian, they're very long titles, very, very, very long titles. So we shorten this paper to the Parare, the opinions. It's 36 pages, and this is, for the first time, an explanation of just what I said. We calculate the force, we calculate the capacity or the strength, we see what the deficiency is, we add iron rods to calculate to make up for the difference, and that's how we solve it. Well, no one really understood it. It's such a far-out revolutionary concept. No one really understood it. The Pope reads it. He didn't understand it either, but within 3 days, he makes multiple copies and sends it up and down the Italian peninsula for other people to weigh in. This is, again, the wisdom of Benedict. He says, look, I don't know if this is right or wrong, but I'm going to ask other people who have experience with construction, design, science, mathematics, philosophers, economists. I'm going to ask for all brands of opinions on this. And for the next 3 months, they all give their opinions. And they all uniformly say, these mathematicians, they don't know what they're doing. And so, and the book goes into this. It talks about all the different theories that these experts had and why these mathematicians are wrong. It includes one of the foremost scientists in Italy. So after Leonardo da Vinci, after Galileo, there's another famous scientist named Giovanni Palleni, probably the most famous scientist you've never heard of. He was the chair of astronomy, mathematics, and physics at the University of Padua. And I don't know if any of you have read Brunelleschi's Dome or anything by Ross King. He's an Italian scholar, a scholar of Italian history. He was generous enough to read my manuscript. In fact, his name is right here. He wrote a blurb, for which I'm very grateful. When he returned the manuscript to me, he said, Wayne, I had never heard of Giovanni Palleni. So when you have a scholar of Italian history telling you that you've actually enlightened him, that made me very proud. So again, it just goes to show that he's the most famous scientist you have probably never heard of, right? But he becomes a key figure at this point because because he is known at the time as a lead professor or leading light in science in Italy, he then gets tapped on the shoulder by Benedict, because Benedict knows science, and he knows Polenyi exists, and he knows that, hey, look, I need someone really wise to help me adjudicate this, because I have these 3 mathematicians telling me something that kind of sounds reasonable, but it's revolutionary and no one believes them. On the other hand, there's a bunch of these other opinions that are kind of conventional, and I'm not sure if it's going to get me where I need to go. So Polenyi comes in and he becomes sort of like the middle road. And he eventually ends up siding with von Vitelli, which is just add more steel rods. Now, the difference is, of course, the mathematician said add steel rods, and so does von Vitelli, and so does Polenyi. So you may say, what's the difference, right? They're both all saying the same thing. What's so revolutionary about the mathematicians? Here's the difference. Polenyi, actually von Vitelli in particular, is saying, well, that's what we do. That's how we solve this problem. The mathematicians were saying, we are going to actually figure this out mathematically. I'm going to give you the exact size of the iron bars that's necessary because I've calculated the force, I've calculated the capacity, and I know the deficiency, and the precise size of these iron bars are exactly what you need to carry this force, which is exactly how we do things today. Now, Polenyi doesn't quite buy everything the mathematicians are saying, but he understands what is being said. He is more concerned about the precision of the solution. So he comes in and develops a whole range of alternative theories, but now he's talking in mathematical and science terms. He's not just talking by intuition. So these mathematicians have forced the conversation now and steered the conversation away from this traditional intuition, and now they're forcing everyone to think about science and solving it in a much more rational way. This is also the time of the Enlightenment, right, where rational thought is promoted. It's how you solve things. It's how you think through things. So Polenyi, although he disagrees with the mathematicians' use of mathematics, in fact, he says mathematics is good for many things, but in this case, it's been abused. Because he was thinking about mathematics as sort of this enclave of academics. He wasn't thinking about mathematics as a way to use it in the real world to solve practical problems. So they end up deciding uniformly, you got to add these steel bars. And then within 9 months, the decision is made to reinforce the dome with 9 bars. This is phenomenal. Even today, it would take longer than that to come to a consensus on what to do. He did it in 9 months, and given the slower pace of life, the fact that a lot of this work takes place in the winter where it's more difficult for communication, they don't have advanced communication systems the way we do. So it is really phenomenal that Benedict comes to a decision and says, we're going to do this, and now it's June 1743. And within a month, they start fabricating these domes, and they start delivering the hoops. I call them the hoops. They're called hoops or chains, rings. They fabricate them in a foundry, and then they deliver them to the site or the Vatican. And what they would do is, and the book goes into this, they lay out the rings on the Piazza di San Pietro because they want to find out if there are any defects in the iron. And it's much easier to fix the defect when it's on the ground than when you're 400 feet in the air, right? So, and then they would fit it out, and then they would lift the bars bar by bar through the various access. There were 3 access chambers that would take you up from the ground floor up to the roof, but that's just the beginning of the dome. And then what they would do is they would lift through ropes, they would haul through ropes and the bars up to the scaffolds, where the workers would then start to do their work. And it's a very complex operation. The book goes into that. But it's guided by this one character who's probably my favorite, whose name is Nicola Zabalia. He is 79 years old at the time. He's been at the Vatican since he's been 14 or 16, something like that. So he has been around, in and around Rome and the Vatican almost his whole life. His work is phenomenal because he develops a system of many things. He improves the tools, the equipment, and most importantly, the scaffolds. In and around St. Peter's. St. Peter's is a huge basilica. It always needs cleaning. It always needs repairs. So how do you access 15 stories in the air? How do you get people up there? How do you keep them there? How do you keep them safe? Especially, how do you get them when they're 300 feet, 400 feet in the air, right? You can't do it from the ground. So he invents these scaffolds that were actually burrowed into the structure, almost looking like a beehive. And the book goes into that. Many images starting here. And here's Zabalia. And these are some of his scaffolds. All of these images, I like to give credit to the Marquand Library, because Rachel, who was the leading research librarian, was bent over backwards. She didn't know me from Adam. And when I described my mission, I needed to get to the Castelli Ponte, and they had the copy. There were several images I wanted to use. She couldn't have been better about it. She, these images have to be, you can't just cut and paste them. You can't just get them off the internet, because to print them, you need a density per inch, a DPI, which is very, very high. And you have to go to the original document. It has to be copied very carefully with equipment that is very precise. And she couldn't have been more helpful. And I'm in touch with her even today. She said, "Hey, Wayne, on your next project, keep us in mind," that kind of thing. So I'm very grateful to her. So Zabalia erects these scaffolds. And you got to remember, these scaffolds they don't start until you're a football field high, and they go for another half a football field above. There's no hard hats, there's no work boots, there's no electricity, there's no respirators, and it's very dusty and murky up there. The lighting's not good. It's not exactly the safest condition. And you're up there all day, right? You can't just come down for lunch. I mean, you're up there way up. It's an adventure just getting up there. So he built these like little cities up there, and they were safe, they were sturdy, they had plenty of sort of acreage to keep all the tools, equipment, all the activities in check. And he's like the unsung hero, because you can have all this theoretical debate about number of bars, how big they should be, whether or not they'll fix it. But if you don't install them, then it's all academic. It's pure academic. So he gets tremendous credit. And then, so at the end of all that, the dome there's 5 iron rings, gets installed. Within a year and a half, it's done. About 3 years later, they're doing an inspection, and there were original rings built in 1590 at the very peak of the dome. And the workers who are inspecting it see that those rings have snapped. And that is where the problem began, at the lantern, very peak, the lantern. And so everyone catches their breath and says, oh, have we solved the problem or not? Well, it turns out that they were pretty confident that was an old issue. They thought it looked like it was not a fresh crack. It was a crack that had gone back decades, probably from a lightning strike. They get a lot of lightning, and it's the tallest structure. So that combination, you get a lot of lightning strikes on the dome. So what happens, Zabalia is called back into action 3 years later to do it all over again, but this time just to fix one more iron ring at the very top. But this time, they're way, you can't get any higher. You're 460 feet above the street. And when, just for context, when I was in Florence a few years ago on the research and looking down into climbing the dome, looking down into before you climb the dome, you can look down into the crossing. You're at 185 feet. And you look down and you can get vertigo, right? That's 185 feet. These workers are working at more than twice that height, right? I mean, it's one of those things where you can't appreciate it until you're at that height and you're looking down. It's scary. Right? And these workers, and that's why, even today, these iron workers who work on skyscrapers, it's a machismo thing. They relish the fact that they can work at heights that few people can have the stomach for, and that's part of their badge of honor. And these workers really were pioneers in high-rise construction. So the mathematicians actually never quite get their due on this particular episode because Polanyi's come in and he's kind of validated Von Vitelli. And the Pope is happy because the dome is fixed. So the mathematician, and by the way, they had no construction experience, so they probably wouldn't be involved in the construction operation anyway. So they become sort of the backstory. But what happens is that Parare, their paper, starts to take traction. And within 25 years, these concepts of calculating, thinking of a problem in the real world, figuring out that you can calculate forces, that you have capacity of the structure, how do you balance the two? If they're out of balance, what do you do to reinforce it? This concept starts to take on a life of its own. And then within 50 years, it starts to become common practice. And within 90 years, it is now taught at French universities as the methodology for what we call engineering. So what happened underneath Michelangelo's dome is the birth of engineering, the way we practice engineering today. And I know that some people, when you read a book and they say, oh, the Roman engineers, or the Egyptians had engineering technique. And they did, but it was visceral. It was intuitive. It was, how do we tinker and solve a problem in the real world? This is modern engineering. This is actually using arithmetic calculation. This is actually figuring out numerically, how do you calculate a force? How do you calculate what we call capacity? How do we blend the two together to solve a problem in the real world? And it doesn't just stop at designing buildings, tunnels, bridges. It's all over. It's an iPhone. It's an automobile. It's a spacecraft. It's the refrigeration systems that keep your food cool. It's the medicines. It's the research, medical technology that we develop. What's the problem? What's the problem? We need to diagnose disease. Okay, how do we figure that out? Well, we need some kind of detection system. Okay, how do we figure that out? Well, let's go to our toolkit of science and mathematics and try to develop a machine that will do those things. And you tinker, you're not always successful. You do it again and again and again, then you solve the problem. The iPhone was not solved one time. The iPhone went through iterations and iterations and iterations to come up with a solution. It's the way all engineers work, but it's all based on the principle of what's the problem in the real world that people actually need to have solved? And then how do we take our toolkit of science and math, blend them together, and solve that problem? So engineers, by design, are anonymous. They are anonymous. They are there to solve the society's problems. And society doesn't know about science nearly the way they do. They don't know about math the way they do. They just come up with the machine or the end product that solves the problem. And people say, oh, my problem's solved. They could care less about who solved it, right? So by nature, engineers are anonymous, and that's the way it is today. Engineers are largely anonymous, and they have to work in teams because no one person has the answers, right? You need, oh, this person has expertise in physics, another person has expertise in chemistry, another person has expertise in a particular kind of mathematic formula. So by design, engineers are based on teamwork, and it's anonymous. When I wrote this book, I certainly have a higher appreciation for engineering as an engineer. But I came to realize why this book had never been written. For all I just gave you this story, right? This is not an easy story to learn. I learned this story over 2 years, and there's no one source. I had to go through hundreds of sources to put this all together. For example, every article, paper always talked about, oh, then the Pope talked to the mathematicians. The Pope reached out to the mathematicians. Oh, then 3 mathematicians came in. And I said to myself, how did this Pope know about these mathematicians, right? How in the world did he possibly know these mathematicians? So part of I was determined. I wanted to know, how did this Pope, what circles did they travel in? And I found it. There were multiple circles, and I found it. And I said, well, maybe I'm the first one probably who's figured that out. So I was just determined to connect the dots, and it was very rewarding that way. I was very rewarding. But then the other thing was, I wanted to write it in a way that people could understand, right? Because all the papers and articles that had been written about it were written from one professor to another professor, for one professional conference to another professor. You couldn't, trust me, I've read a lot of technical papers. I could not understand many of these papers. I would have to read them 3, 4, 5 times to understand what are they trying to say, and I eventually get it. But look, I can't write a book and have anyone have that patience. So I had to write it in a way that would be accessible. So engineers are good for a lot of things, but good writing is not especially one of them. And I knew I had a pretty good grasp of writing. So I said, look, that's why this book had never been written. It's a hard book to write, and it hasn't been written well. So if I can do that, I think it'll be a success. So the good news is, so far, the last time my publisher told me, we've sold 4,000 copies in 3 months. And when I gave a similar talk at the Winchester Public Library yesterday. When I was there, and I'm just for fun, I checked the card catalog. And I said, oh, how many, I know they have a copy in the library. So I just put it in the card catalog. Well, it turns out they have 5 copies, and they're all out, being read. And then they have all the lists of the same title at the other surrounding libraries in the network. Belmont, Lexington, Medford, etc. They all have a copy, and they're all out being read. And I said, oh, that's pretty good. People are kind of catching on. So that was very heartwarming. So the book is so far being well received, as far as I know. I got a very nice review in the Wall Street Journal. And when I resisted temptation, because it's good advice that Laurie says, don't check Amazon, because even though you might be a bestseller, you're not going to be a bestseller long. And you bounce around a lot, and don't be surprised if you go down to 122. But the interesting thing about Amazon is one day you could be 59, the next day you can be 14. It's very, I don't know how they do it, but it's kind of sensitive to how your book's doing and how the other books are doing, right? They have this complicated algorithm. All that said, the book is now in Australia, New Zealand, England, Canada. A friend of mine took a photograph from a bookshop in London and said, Wayne, your book's like right there. It's not on the bottom, not at the top, it's like right at eye level. So it's done pretty well, and I'm very blessed. But at the end of the day, it's really about the characters. I think if there's success to the book, I'm just the conduit, right? I was fortunate enough to find a good story, a great story, populated by a terrific episode, but it's the characters that drove the story. And I think more than that, more than anything, it's the characters who personify what happened. And more than anything, it's Benedict, right? And Benedict XIV, it would not have happened without Benedict XIV. The two popes that preceded him were old and kind of feeble and didn't have the mental stamina to recognize the issue or to try to see it through. The two popes that came after, Clement the 13th and 14th, see how I know those popes now? They were indecisive by nature. They just weren't, they weren't people of, let's do it. So when you think about like divine inspiration, think about it. This dome was teetering on the precipice of disaster, right? And if it didn't fail or collapse in 1742, I don't know, would it collapse in 1750 or 1760? Yeah, it could very well, right? So you had a window here. And when you think of the fact that this guy did not campaign to be Pope, we don't think he wanted to be Pope, but he became the Pope. On top of that, he was interested in science. He saw that science was like part of God's magnificence. He wasn't intimidated by it. He wasn't scared to search for alternative solutions or solutions that were not common. And by that, I mean, he was unconventional. You know, he promoted women. He promoted education for girls. He advanced the health and well-being of hospitals. He forbade torture in prison in Bologna, which was quite common in those days. He was very progressive. So you got to ask yourself, there has to have been some kind of divine sort of inspiration there when you think about his influence almost single-handedly in deciding that they had to do something and choosing the right people to gather around him and to come up with a solution and to do it quickly, right? And when you think about that, you gotta say there probably was some kind of divine presence there. And I was just so fortunate to discover all of this and to try to put it all together. So thank you for your attention. I appreciate it very much.
I believe we have time for 1, 2, maybe 3 questions.
Okay.
And then we need to move on. So
Okay. I saw the first hand. Has the first hand, yes. Yes.
And then we'll take one more question.
Okay, fine.
First question I looked at the book about 2 weeks ago. I saw your timelines, and the thing that caught my eye immediately was Brunelleschi's dome in Florence.
Right.
That's a hemispheric dome. It was built in 1750, 1452, 150 years later. This was put up. It's an elliptical type dome. It's not very different. And so, why didn't I go back and look at that and realize that dome still has never cracked? That's 550 years. Why didn't they go back and look at that dome and realize I've been up the top of that dome, been inside it.
Right.
And so, that's why I understand why these mathematicians or the engineers said we have something that worked, really worked, whereas this dome did not work because it's elliptical and it needed to be pulled together. That's why you have the weights in the middle there. Pull it together. I mean, those are very simple scientific things.
So,
I understand why those engineers didn't go back and look at that and say, that is number one. Let's look at that.
okay,
The science existed then.
fine. So I'm gonna have to burst your bubble because. Oh, sure. So the question is, why wasn't there a recognition that what had been successful at Brunelleschi's dome in Florence, why couldn't you just mirror that, as I think I'm paraphrasing, why couldn't you mirror that successful story here in Rome? I think that's,
I didn't say that. I said, why didn't look at that?
why didn't they look at it? Okay. So it's actually a really long answer, but I don't I'm going to make it as short as possible. The dome, the cupola, in Italian, cupola is dome. The cupola in Florence is actually more oval than it is hemispheric. And it's not a coincidence that the dome at St. Peter's looks like that, because Michelangelo was from Florence. He grew up in Florence. He admired the dome at Florence. And he actually made a point of saying, I'm going to Rome to make a dome not more beautiful, but bigger than the dome at Florence. So the way the dome looks is not a coincidence. Michelangelo intended for there to be similarity. And the mathematicians were not tasked with trying to change the shape of the dome. The mathematicians were trying to just prevent the dome from collapsing. Okay.
I understand that, but it took much less knowledge to do that than it did to put something.
No. I wouldn't shortchange it. By the way, all of these domes take tremendous knowledge. Brunelleschi's dome, Michelangelo's dome, and what the mathematicians did. Tremendous knowledge to design and to construct. So domes are probably the most complicated structures to build. And so I think what I would say to your observation is that every generation tries to solve these problems with the latest tools that are available based on the circumstances that they're facing. So Brunelleschi tried to solve the problem his way. Della Porta, who built the dome of St. Peter's, he used the tools and technology of his day. He was told to build the dome in 2 years. Brunelleschi had 16. Okay, so they're going to build it in a different way. And then the mathematicians were not tasked with rebuilding, they were tasked with saving. And they were the Pope asked them, what can we do to save it? And so they came up with a solution based on what they thought was the prudent way to go. So, next question.
So I'm going to ask a question. Are you familiar with the solution to Boston's biggest architectural disaster of recent history, the Hancock Building? I have been told, but this may only be part of the story, that the main part of the solution was adjusting the HVAC system to deal with pressure differences.
Oh.
Is that the case, or are you not familiar?
Are you talking about in the 70s with the glasses popping out? Yeah, so there's different, I haven't been in touch with that building for a few years, but when I was, there were two issues going on, two theories, and maybe both of them have legitimacy. One was that the building was tall and slender, so you had a lot of sway. And the way you kind of counteract that is putting these heavy weights at the very top of the building, and they counterweight. The counterweights will help to minimize that sway. They move in reaction, opposite reaction to the wind. The other theory was that the shape of the building, which is sort of like a trapezoid, it was creating a torsional, the wind was causing a torsional twisting, which was putting stress on the windows. And they were, so I'm not familiar about the HVAC and the pressures. Maybe that's a new theory that has evolved over time. It wouldn't surprise me. It might be a combination of all three. Yeah. So Jay, I'll let you adjudicate who the last question is.
Mary.
Thank you for the lovely
Mary will
the
shoot
book.
you.
I don't know about that, but I just want to say I just started to read the book, and I thought the first couple pages I couldn't get through it fast enough. I was really
thank you.
impressed with it.
Thank you.
Question for you: you mentioned the librarian, and I was thinking about these images, and I have been to some libraries in Italy, which are I've never seen those being an American, so I thought they were amazing. Do you have some favorite ones, and where did you do most of your research for that? Because that's very unusual.
Right, so.
And without speaking.
Yeah, I'm not an Italian speaker, although you get better at reading it a little bit. But thankfully, a lot of this information is digitized. And there's one particular portal that's excellent if you're interested in doing research at the Getty Research Portal. They have, if they don't have it in their collection, they tell you where you can find it. And it saves an amazing amount of time if you can get it digitally. But I did go to research libraries. So I went to the Huntington Library. So Castile e Ponte, which is the book that Zabalia published on his scaffold system, the Huntington had multiple copies. So, by the way, when you get into, it's not like you just go to these libraries and you just knock on their doors and they let you in. These research libraries are very selective on who they allow in and what the purpose is, how long you will be there, rules of engagement. There's a centralized reading room. You can't bring in any personal stuff. You can't even bring in pencils. Interestingly, you can bring your iPhone and you can take pictures, but you can't bring in anything else. You might be able to bring in paper, a pad of paper, but they supply the pencils or pens. They just don't want any possibility. They want to reduce the possibility of damage to the book. Then what? No ink. Oh, no, absolutely not. And when you get the book, especially if it's a rare book, what they do is they give you a pillow. And you crease it. You lay it down, and then you lay the book down so that the spine is not stressed, right? It makes perfect sense, right? They have all these interesting rules. But if you wanted to get to the Vatican Library, it's almost impossible, except if, I mean, you need to get 3 or 4 letters of recommendation from noted authorities. You have to tell them months in advance. You have to have specific scope of work. And I'm sure if once you've been to inside the Vatican Library, then you're one of the, you're part of the group. But for a newcomer, it's almost impossible to get into the Vatican Library. But there's many other libraries you can get into. But the trick is you have to tell them, you have to give them credentials. And again, like in my case, I had good credentials. I'm writing a book. I actually can demonstrate. They want to see the demonstration that you're writing a book, that it's a legitimate book. It's not that there's anything wrong with self-publishing, but this is going to be a major publishing house. You have, like everything else, you have to prove yourself time and time again when you're doing this thing. So, but the digital versions of these books were incredibly helpful. Yeah.
Excuse me, one more question, and then
yes.
we'll move on to
Yes, and I'll be glad to answer questions one-on-one if you have them.
Thank you. So my question is, so you're a professional structural engineer and you're a modern engineer. What was it like to immerse yourself in a world of sort of pre-modern construction?
Can you repeat that?
Sure. As a modern structural engineer, or a structural engineer working in the modern world, what was it like for me to go back in time and try to place myself in the shoes of those who were practicing in construction at the time?
Pioneers.
Yeah, so they were pioneers. I've done a lot of research over the years on construction techniques and the way structures are designed. So I knew a lot of this myself. What I think, before going into the book, but I think what I enjoyed more or appreciated more after doing the research was seeing it from the perspective of Nicola Zabalia and his team, and seeing it from the perspective of Luigi Vanvitelli and what he actually did day to day. It wasn't a surprise to me that they were encountering these kind of what we would call barriers. But it made me appreciate even more just how different and how daring, to his point, just how pioneering they were. Yeah, and the conditions were not nearly as safe. It was an uncertain outcome. There were a lot of building failures. We think of the great failures like the Leaning Tower of Pisa, right? That's a classic. But there are dozens and dozens of buildings just like that. And construction has always been an imperfect profession. And this research and writing just affirmed that much more than I ever really appreciated. Thanks for that. Thanks. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate your attention.